Episode also, in a way, re-established if some people had doubt about the conventional deterrence capability of Pakistan. I think that episode proved that we have a effective and a credible conventional deterrence also. Every person thinks of themselves as a Maverick or a Top Gun, and that's something that gets going the young fighter pilots. They want to excel and they want to perform their best, and that's the kind of competition in each squadron, in the fighter squadrons. That's the culture. You have to compete, otherwise you won't be able to survive.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders and change makers from around the world. Today I'm joined by a former Air Force officer and a serving academic. He's the Dean Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies and acting chair of the Department of Strategic Studies at the Air University. I have with me Dr. Adil Sultan, who will be speaking about Pakistan Air Force and the changing dynamics of air and space power in modern warfare. Dr. Adil, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Dr. Adil, let me start this conversation with this very first question. You started your career in the Air Force, right, as a pilot. But then what really contributed to this change of heart where you decided to pick up the world of becoming a scholar?
It was not, in fact, change of heart, change of fate. So
Why
I had an
was that?
accident where I had to eject from an aircraft while I was an instructor at one of the fighter squadrons. So we had this accident and I had to eject. So I was medically unfit for a couple of months and a little over a year. So then I had a choice whether to stay in the Air Force and fly slow aircraft or the transport aircraft, or make something better out of my life. So that's how this drift or shift from Air Force to the strategic side, because then I got the opportunity to do my master's from Quaid-e-Azam University. And that got me excited in this discipline on strategic studies, because we were at that time relatively very young nuclear weapon state. Not many people who are writing about these issues, not studying these issues. So that is how this interest in strategic issues transpired, and this was a shift. I stayed in uniform, but half of my career in the military, I worked on strategic issues, the nuclear issues.
But how much did you really fly missing versus, immersing yourself into scholastic activities?
Flying is something fascinating that it's never enough. But for fighter flying, there is an age. So at one time, you have to shift towards administrative. Once you move towards higher appointments and the positions, the administrative task gets more and the flying gets lesser and lesser, and that's a natural phenomenon.
Right. And so now speaking about, flying itself, I'll come to your academic life and everything. But let me speak about flying itself. You as someone who's actually, flown fighter aircrafts, what is the most romantic bit about, flying a fighter jet versus the non-romantic elements of it?
Romantic, it's again a relative thing, because if somebody loves flying, there's no match for it. But there are certain people who don't like flying, but they are put into that kind of a job. For them, it becomes a fatigue kind of a thing.
So how was it for you, who probably, I'm presuming you really liked flying, didn't you?
Definitely. I loved flying
Right.
as long as I flew in the Air Force. And there's something that it's a kind of a dream come true once you're in the Air Force. Even for any youngster, that
Right.
you end up flying fighter aircrafts, and where you can do plenty of things, adventures, and it is fascinating.
So were you the kind of Maverick, Top Gun kind of a flying officer, or were you,
That's the interesting part about
Yeah.
the fighter pilots.
Right,
Every person thinks of themselves as a Maverick or a Top Gun.
right.
And that's something that gets going the young fighter pilots. They want to excel and they want to perform their best. And that's the kind of competition in each squadron, in the fighter squadrons. That's the culture. You have to compete, otherwise you won't be able to survive.
Right. And so now speaking about the non-romantic bits about, being a fighter pilot, what are the most difficult things that people from the outside are not able to relate or not able to imagine or visualize about those challenges that you as a fighter pilot really have to face?
It's a risky business because God never wanted people to fly. If God wanted people to fly, He would have given them wings. So it's a natural process, a risky business. Lots of accidents happen. You lose lots of your colleagues. Some get unfit. Some they crash in the line of duty. And that's something that you have to go along. That's part of this profession. It's a risky business. You get unfit, you get off from the mainstream, or if something happens to you, so then your families suffer. So that is a price that you have to pay if you are in this business.
And so what's the culture of camaraderie that sort of helps, Air Force officers, even, when they go through challenging or risky situations like you yourself did? What were the most important things that really helped you recuperate both physically and mentally out of that situation?
Physically, you have to remain fit because this is a challenging profession. This is demanding physically also and also mentally also. So lots of time there are situations which are quite difficult. So where your senior colleagues, they come in, they help you out. And that's a culture in these squadrons where the seniority or senior, if you are senior or junior, it does matter to an extent. But once you are flying, you are in the cockpit, and you are equally responsible for your colleague, whether he is a senior or a junior. So that's a special bonding that if you are flying with the base commander, but in air you would be kind of equals because you have to protect his tail and he has to protect your tail in a combat. So that's the kind of culture that you have to develop, and this happens everywhere, all over the world for the fighter flying.
Right. And when you eventually, decided to become a scholar, what were some of the challenges that you really had to grapple with in order to, make that transition itself? Even something like this, which was forced upon fate on you, how did you sort of, make that transition?
So it was an accidental transition. Like I said, I met an accident. I had to eject from the aircraft, and because that process is quite risky, difficult, it does inflict certain kind of injuries, also mostly back problems. Fighter pilots, they have to, if somebody goes through that process. So then it was a choice for me. Either I mark my time in the Air Force, flying some other aircraft, or do something more tangible. So that's how this transition, I said earlier, that this opportunity was given to me by the Air Force to do 2 years master's, and I did that master's. I started liking that subject, the strategic studies issues, and that's where I built my career on the academic side and the scholarly.
Right. And how did you overcome the challenges that you confronted along the way?
Yeah, challenges, yes. During those times,
becoming this budding scholar, now that
absolutely.
you were in this new role.
Interestingly, during those times, because we used to fly most of the Chinese aircraft at that time, this was a common thing that the fighter pilots or the frontline fighters, it was a perception or a misconception that they don't have to study much. But this is not true. And especially now, because of the high-tech gadgetry, the equipment that is involved, you have to excel in the academics also and studies also. But at that time, the culture was slightly different. That as long as you are good in your profession, you are good handling aircraft good, you're performing best. So you don't have to study much, or study in a sense that there are certain courses that you have to do for your promotion, things like that. So we, at that time, young fighter pilots, we thought that as long as we are in the cockpit and performing good, we won't have to study. But once I shifted towards the academic side, then of course the survival is that if you want to make your place, you have to study. And that was the biggest challenge. But over a period of time, and especially in that age, because you're not that young, you are in a certain profession where you have certain status, and you have to study books that you have never studied before, because it's completely different, these strategic studies I'm talking about. So that was a challenge, but over a period of time, yes, everybody gets along. So that's how I also made it.
Did you have to force yourself, or was there someone who sort of, gave you that very important bit of advice that helped you What was it like?
Uh, no, it was not enforced by anyone because otherwise you can't survive in this academic field unless you develop that interest. So it was more about that you started reading about these issues, and since, as I said, we had become a nuclear weapon state, we conducted our test in 1998. So this was something fascinating, something new to learn, because we were studying a lot about Western literature. There was not much available about South Asian literature, about India, Pakistan, nuclear issues. So that is how it got interesting, and I started reading this, and this is how my interest also developed in the academic side.
Right. And how much do you think your experience as a practitioner, as a fighter pilot, sort of helped you in adjusting in this, in this new role, or perhaps, you trying to understand those very same things, more from a scholastic outlook? How much was that really helpful? Your prior experience?
Yes, definitely it did help because while in service, while in uniform, you think a lot about security issues and how to protect your country. You groom yourself, and the environment grooms you to become that defender or a soldier. So that's something natural. But there's one fundamental difference between conventional and nuclear. While we were in the Air Force, we were being trained how to fight wars and win a war. And the nuclear domain, once you enter, it is all about how not to fight a war, but use your nuclear weapons for deterrence purpose and your political objectives. That's one major difference that people generally don't understand from the conventional military and the nuclear side. But overall, it's part of the security debate. So that's how it does help you in grooming in that field also.
Now, let's sort of bring our attention to this important development that's taking place around the world when we, look at these global developments that are taking place in the domain of warfare itself. And I don't want to really make it more of a scholastic conversation, but when we look at some of the recent conflicts that have broken out, even in Northern Africa or across the Middle East, or even in regions that are near to home, we see a growing role of drones becoming more prominent in the force center. How do you really see that development? Are they sort of like changing the overall dynamic of air power today? And how do you see its future going forward?
Military has always evolved with the introduction of new technologies, the concepts, the way you fight these wars. This is an evolutionary process. Once aircraft were introduced, it was something considered as strategic at that time. It changed the dynamics of a conflict, of a war. So that process is ongoing. So new technologies, whenever they are introduced, initially people start to focus sometimes more than what is required. New concepts are evolved. So that's what is happening now also. It has happened before also. So I don't think it's changing the concept in once you talk about the air power or air warfare. I think it's more to do that these capabilities, if integrated into overall air power domain, they can give you more dividends in terms of efficiency. These are more effective, cost effective, and that's why many of the countries, they are adapting to these new technologies. Let me give you an example. If you recall Gulf War I, suddenly there was a surge that probably the Air Force is going to be the future tool or instrument for winning wars, because United States had that unprecedented technological advantage over the rest of its contemporaries. So it did create certain impact. And that's how many air forces around the world, they started to shape up their doctrines, how to achieve as best as possible the political objectives, because in the end, it's all about political objectives. War is all about politics. So if you are able to, and these days the wars are not about capturing each other's territories and occupying those territories. It's more about if your political interests are achieved. So if you can use these tools to achieve those political objectives more efficiently, definitely there's more market for that. So during that Gulf War, there was significant change in thought process, how future wars would be conducted. And we saw in various regions, areas, we saw in Afghan war also, the aerial platforms were used to destroy whatever they considered was their adversaries or targets, and they probably achieved certain objectives because it does reduce that human cost factor also. These tools or toys are expensive, but in the end, if countries are more worried about not losing humans, so this is more efficient. Now, with this introduction of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, I think the cost in terms of humans is going to be reduced further. And this is something probably it would add to the air power, but it would not replace air power as such, because there are many instances where human factor would always be there. Many people thought during last part of the previous century that probably pilots would be obsolete in the next century because of the automation, the unmanned aerial vehicles. But over a period of time, I think people have learned these lessons that yes, these new technologies are important. They are creating impact. But for now, pilot would remain an important critical element in that use of that air power.
I'll come back to pilots and manned aircrafts. But speaking of a conflict like Azerbaijan-Armenia war, were you really surprised by the way the drones were used in that conflict?
I don't think so. These drones, as we saw this, the use, effective use in the Afghan war also.
No, but what about the loitering munition? Were you surprised by the way that they were being used by the Azeris against the Armenian forces?
No, I was not surprised. Yes, it did create some impact, but every conflict is different. So if it was very successful in Azerbaijan, it may not be effective in some other part of the world. So every conflict has its different characteristics, and some weapon systems could work more efficiently in a certain situation, and the same weapon system may not work in a different conflict scenario or a battlefield. But yes, it did attract lots of attention around the globe, and many countries are now following the same path, that in addition, we need to develop these capabilities also that can play a certain role.
Where do you think drones and unmanned aircrafts could be working together in a conflict scenario?
It all depends upon the objectives, how you develop your postures, your forces, the postures. What are the objectives? Are you preparing for an all-out war? Are you preparing for a limited conflict? Or if you're an aggressor or a defender. So I think all these factors would come into play.
But if you were to think of any operational scenario where you think the two can be used together, where there could be a better teaming, what would that look like?
It's quite hypothetical question. But one example is that this the threat of non-state actors that has emerged post 9/11. So these non-state actors are everywhere. So dissidents or insurgents are now in many parts of the world. So many countries, probably they think these tools are more useful for limited strikes against non-state actors because they are agile. They can loiter for a longer time. And there's less human cost involved, because if you send land forces, it becomes very costly. And by the time you send land forces, the insurgents, they move to a different place because they do not have permanent stations or bases or hideouts. So in that sense, yes, the drones or unmanned aerial vehicles could be useful. Now, if you're talking about hyphenating with the air power, that is something that again, if your objectives are that you are launching strikes against your adversaries' military forces, so probably in that sense, air power or the aircraft with the heavy bombs, those would be more useful. And in that, integrating drones may not be that useful, I would say. But now the drones could also be used to target adversaries' radar systems. So in that sense, yes, some drones can be built, then they can outsmart the defenses and go and strike the enemy radars, and while the main strikes can go and
Right.
but these are all, I think, context specific and specific to any particular scenario, how military postures would evolve with these technologies, and how these equipment could be used.
Right. But bringing the relevance of the conversation to home, speaking of Pakistan Air Force, where do you think their role is likely to grow over here at home of the drones?
Of the drones, it's more of surveillance because it's a very effective tool where you can get the enemy deployments. You can get a better picture, and for targeting non-state actors. So we have these troubled borders on the west. So these are useful against those. But if we look at our major adversaries, which has significant military strength, yes, for limited tit-for-tat kind of operations in the future, I don't know, because every crisis has different ingredients and how it shapes up. Every crisis has a different character. But for limited strikes, yes, these could be, like we witnessed during this Iran against the insurgents across the border in Iran. Probably some drones were used along with the air power, the aircraft, and some land-based missiles also.
Right. And now, speaking of this recent development that has taken place about the decision to induct the FC-31 aircraft, could you tell us a bit about the aircraft itself and what really prompted the decision on part of Pakistan to go ahead with the induction of this platform?
Yes, as per the available information, that's limited. We don't have much about this aircraft because this news, for me, came as a surprise.
Why?
I didn't know, because I'm not part of that process, what is the thinking going on within the Air Force, what kind of platforms they are looking for the future. Definitely, they might have planned something, and that's how your future planning goes. The planning people who are responsible for planning for the future procurements, they might have seen some utility of this aircraft. But as we know, these are more capable in terms of radars, and they can carry more weight also. They would be useful for the future battlefields, as we envisage the future battlefields would entail high-tech equipment in terms of surveillance and the command centers and all those, what the Air Force does. So I think that's where it is going to be useful. Secondly, we had been operating American systems, the F-16s, for decades now. They have certain life. And the trajectory of our bilateral relations, as it seems, probably we may not have access to the spare parts or the more aircraft from the United States in the future. So then Pakistan has to look for the options, because your adversary is increasing its military prowess. So they are getting Rafales from France, and besides other aircraft that they are building themselves with the help of Russia. And some other aircrafts also, they're indigenous also. So they are modernizing their Air Force. So in the future, Pakistan has to maintain that at least some parity in terms of conventional air power, once we say. And like we have done in the past also, we never let that balance go beyond certain limit where we start to feel insecure. And that is where probably our Air Force planners, they are thinking for the future, that if and when F-16s, they are laid off or they complete their life cycles, so would they have another system? So in that sense, I think FC-31 would be one alternative, or there could be other options also in the future.
But then, how do you really think, a platform like FC-31 can impact Pakistan's overall capability?
Definitely, it will add to the punch value also. There are F-16s, which are very capable aircraft. As I said, they have a life cycle. And the FC-31, whenever they come to Pakistan, that could be a good replacement for F-16s also, because they are very capable in terms of avionics, radars, and the payload carrying capacity also. And there are several other features that we don't know about much about these aircraft. But as the news reports are, they are better than many that are in the market, the contemporary aircraft, the 4.5 generation kind of aircraft here.
All right. And now, speaking of the very arm of the armed forces that you served, which was the Air Force, I would really like to ask you, speaking as someone who's actually served in that very arm, how do you think is it really different from the other two arms? I mean, not saying this in any disrespect for the other two arms, because they are as much important for the overall defense of the country as the Air Force is. But what is it that sort of sets it apart from the Army and the Navy?
It can create the desired impact in a very short time. And as the wars or the conflicts that we have seen over the past decade or so, on the likely future wars also, time, surprise, that's way of essence. If you can generate that impact in a very short time and you can achieve that political objectives, your objective is served. And that's what we saw in 2019 also. That we launched a tit for tat kind of a strike, and it created that desired impact, and we came out successful from that episode.
And what is it that sets Pakistan Air Force apart and different from the rest of the air forces from around the world?
Training has been our hallmark. If we see historically also, there are many air forces, they come to Pakistan now, it's a kind of a routine. We collaborate with them, we go to other places also. And every time what we hear is praise about the proficiency of Pakistani Air Force and the pilots especially, and the way quickly they adapt to the new environment, new situations, new scenarios, because it's kind of a futuristic thinking that continuously goes on in the Air Force. What are the future challenges, the likely challenges, and how the Air Force can be employed more efficiently. And that's where we have been successful. Otherwise, you couldn't have delivered a blow to India in 2019 within 24 hours.
Now, speaking of Pulwama-Balakot crisis itself, I mean, it's almost been 4 years now. What do you really think about the crisis, both as someone who served as an Air Force officer and then also as a scholar? I mean, you look back at the crisis after all this while. How do you think the crisis was overall managed by Pakistan itself?
I think if we see overall impact objectively, and not something as having a national bias from the Pakistan Air Force, objectively, all over the world, people did praise the way Pakistan dealt with that crisis and achieved its political and military objectives both by clearly conveying to the others, including India, that there is no space for conflict or war between two nuclear armed neighbors. That specific episode also, in a way, re-established, if some people had doubt about the conventional deterrence capability of Pakistan, I think that episode proved that we have a effective and a credible conventional deterrence also. Because many people were worried about India is spending 7 times more than what Pakistan is spending, and whether our conventional capability is enough, and whether we are relying too much on nuclear capability. I think that episode clarified those doubts also, and it established or it strengthened the nuclear deterrence also, because we didn't go into the behavior of nuclearism, and we acted a very responsible nuclear state also. But at the same time, we demonstrated our conventional capability also, that we have the resources, we have the capability to deal with these kind of crises also.
And do you think internationally there was, or the world over, there was a sense of appreciation and an understanding about the seriousness of the actions that India took when it decided to carry out its airstrike? Because at the end of the day, we're speaking about 2 nuclear-armed countries. Do you think, was there that level of appreciation and understanding what risky business is the world really dealing with?
Yes, there was no doubt that the international community didn't know what is happening between India and Pakistan. And there has always been a concern that any conflict between India and Pakistan can quickly escalate to an all-out war, and where there could be a possibility of a nuclear use. But we were all surprised when many countries in the world, especially United States, they came up openly in support of India, what it wanted to do. And that emboldened India to do something which otherwise no rational actor would think of doing, that you launch an aerial strike across the border against another nuclear weapon state. And we heard those statements in that time that this is how we are going to punish a nuclear weapon state. Now, this is something that the Indian planners probably, they overestimated their capability. It was essential for Pakistan to respond to those challenges, that crisis, in a way that we did, to give a message that you can't do this. You can't continue like this. There is no space for this kind of a conflict between two nuclear armed neighbors. Right. So I think realization was always there, but the way the United States or the West is treating India now exceptionally, that there are no rules or laws for whatever India does against other countries, to its minorities. So India can get away with anything, and they would support India. And they probably underestimated Pakistan's resolve also, that probably we would just take it lying down and we wouldn't respond. There were some dissenting voices in Pakistan also. They were worried about the escalation, and they were not really much fancying this idea of similar kind of a response. But this is how we came out. I think the decision makers made the right choice. And in hindsight, we can all appreciate what Pakistan did at that time. And the adversary also now understands that they will have to come with something new.
And now, speaking of that, that claim that India made, the authorities in India made, that Pakistan lost an F-16. And eventually that story came out in, I suppose, in Foreign Policy magazine, where it was said that Pakistan, there was an audit of the F-16 platforms, and Pakistan had not lost from its inventory of the aircraft any plane. Where do you think it really left the claim that was made by the Indian authorities?
That was a false claim. It didn't have any legs. But what we have seen, what India does, it creates mountain out of a mole, and then it uses its social media platforms within India and outside India. And the like-minded countries, they also support India's narrative, and that's how they build a perception that they are invincible. That claim was false. Pakistan knew it, and it's good that the United States itself leaked that story, that probably it was not F-16 which was shot down. But Indians, they still continue to claim that they shot down F-16s despite the clarification from the United States. This is how India continues to sell those stories, and it is bought by people who want to believe in India.
I have a very tongue-in-cheek question for you. Recently, there was this movie that came out, Fighter. Now, you were someone who's actually flown, Pakistan Air Force aircraft. I have a very funny question, and this is something that's coming right on the spot. Did you ever wear surmah or anything, eye makeup or something, getting ready, sitting in your aircraft and flying them, out into, either for the exercises or for anything, or your routine flying?
I don't know about what happened has transpired in that movie, because many of these such movies I don't watch.
No, they actually. So I haven't watched the movie. I just watched the trailer, and the funny bit is this: that the Pakistani, Air Force pilot is actually wearing loads of surmah in his eyes, and just to make him sort of stand out that this pilot is actually from the Pakistani Air Force. But did you ever do that? I mean,
they saw Pakistani pilots in 2019, so that's their perception, how Pakistani pilot might appear to them. Then such things don't happen. Right. Everybody knows that.
Right.
In the cockpit, you don't wear these kind of things, so you don't go in such a risky business while donning all this makeup and stuff. That's Bollywood.
Yeah. But do you ever use the pet word Janab?
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah.
Right, right. Anyway, speaking back to, coming back to the most serious bits of our conversation. And now this has to do with another crisis that we saw now between two different countries. Not two different, I mean, one country was the same. This was Pakistan and between Iran. And this was on January 16th when Iran actually decided to carry out unprovoked airstrikes on Pakistani territory. And then Pakistan actually swiftly responded back to the airstrikes or the strikes that were carried out by Iran. And again, it was also quite unprecedented in the manner that Pakistan decided to retaliate. I mean, in previous occasions, we really haven't seen Pakistan do that, at least against Iran. Why do you think that really came about? Why did Pakistan really decide that at this point in time, Pakistan really needed to put its foot down and make sure that the deterrence had to be established in kinetic terms and not just diplomatically?
I think it was intended towards two different actors. One, Iran itself, definitely, that you can't do with Pakistan like this. I think that message was very clear. The other important actor was our eastern adversary. Because what we have seen over the past several years, whenever there are elections in India, they carry out something funny inside Pakistan and then they blame Pakistan for that, and they use such episodes for their domestic politics. We saw that in 2019. It was more related to domestic politics, where Prime Minister Modi wanted to prove himself as a very strong nationalist leader who can take punitive measures against a neighboring nuclear weapon state. So that was the whole objective about that ill-thought aerial surgical strike that India carried out. So this time also, there were signals the way Pakistan is sold in their domestic narratives, that many of the BJP leaders, they were using Pakistan for their own domestic politics. And there were concerns that they might again make a similar kind of a blunder or mistake against Pakistan. So yes, Iran did what it shouldn't have done. But then we have different kind of relations with Iran. So we also demonstrated certain restraint, and there were diplomatic outreach also. Let's settle over this case over here. And I'm glad that both the sides, they realized and it was normalized. But the other important actor, I think that was kind of a preemption from Pakistani side to deliver a message to the other adversary. You can't do this. If we can do this with our neighboring, relatively friendly country, what we can do to you, you shouldn't indulge in this kind of a brinkmanship in the near future while there are elections in India. So I think that message has gone loud and clear to the Indian decision makers also.
Traditionally, Pakistan has continued to articulate a very firm policy when it comes to its eastern neighbor, India, when it comes to its overall policy of deterrence. Do you think Pakistan has now been put into a position where it has to articulate a policy about its, the rest of the Western Front as well? When you speak of countries like Afghanistan, or when you even speak of countries like Iran as well, that there are certain red lines that probably ought not to be crossed.
Yes, unfortunate. The regional environment has evolved over the past few years as like this, where we do not have much control because there are so many external actors they are playing in our neighborhood that we will continue to face these challenges. And coupled with our domestic challenges also, our internal weaknesses also, the economic and the political also. Many countries probably they find a space or an incentive to hit Pakistan where it can hurt us. So that's why probably there was a need to give that signals to our neighbors also. We might be weak for the moment, for now, but you can't take that weakness for guaranteed and do something that can hurt our long-term interests. So that kind of a signaling was probably necessary, and we can see that in the Iranian context also. Because many people believe that what Iran did, probably it was not well thought out or politically cleared. It was an act by few elements within their administration who may not be in sync with their national leadership. And those elements could be inspired by some third parties also, by actors, outside actors. They could have used Iran or instigated those actors to take that kind of a military action against Pakistan. So that's why it was important to give that signal to our neighboring countries that if you think that we are internally weak and you can exploit that situation, this is not going to happen.
And now, speaking of a bit about the Air Force history itself, and I'm sure many people who are from the younger generation, and that sort of applies to me as well, because when I was born, the conflict in Afghanistan or the Soviet presence in Afghanistan was already coming to an end. Could you tell us a bit about that chapter? When Pakistani Air Force and the Afghan Air Force back then had a bit of I must say, quite a friction in itself between each other in that phase when the Soviet forces were occupying Afghanistan.
That was almost, it was a conflict, ongoing conflict. So we didn't see Afghanistan from the lens that we see Afghanistan now. At that time, it was a Soviet influence, and whatever Afghan government was doing, that was doing at the behest of the former Soviet Union.
And what was taking place between the two air forces back then?
There were some aerial clashes between Pakistan Air Force. We did shoot down some one aircraft also, and also the Soviet aircraft fighters also. We had newly acquired these F-16s during that time, and we continue to hear from our elders from the Air Force these stories about they were on patrol 24/7, day and night. And some of the stories, some episodes that happened where one aircraft did try to intrude inside Pakistan, the Soviet aircraft did try to, and those were one of the few earlier shootings that happened during 80s, where we also happened to shoot down one of the Soviet fighter aircraft, where the pilot eventually, then subsequently, it became a deputy prime minister of in Russia also, and he did visit Pakistan also. So there are many fascinating stories where the Air Force played very active role, because our military was not engaged on ground with the Soviet forces. What we were doing, everybody knows now. We were pushing the Mujahideen, and they were fighting a war with the support of United States and many other countries who were funding that war. Our boots were not on ground, but our Air Force was there in the air to provide that cover to them also, and it did play an important role during the Soviet war, the first Soviet.
And there are also some war trophies, that belong to the Afghan Air Force as well. Where they are exactly right now?
I exactly don't know, but we had. Yeah. We did shoot down some of the aircraft.
I think some of them are lying in Pakistan Air Force Museum in Karachi.
Few are there in the museum also, and some are at the different bases also. So these are stories that we heard from our seniors also, and we saw some of the documentary evidence also. We read a lot about these. Yes, these
right.
are there.
And now, speaking of some of the developments that can transform the overall region and the stability, that delicate term, not the delicate term, but the delicate balance of power that we actually have in the region itself. What are some of the top 3 developments that you think can actually threaten that in the near future?
Air power is one, the way it is transforming. And I think aerospace or the space, because I term air power and space together, and I've been saying that we need to look at the future and we need to develop our Air Force to become an aerospace power for the future. Your space is going to be a major domain which can affect the outcome of any conflict. So these are 2 things that I think we need to evolve our Air Force into something where we can utilize these unmanned combat aerial vehicles also, UAVs into this, and also integrate into these space systems by having more systems in the space. That's where we are lacking now. The space domain, if we compare ourselves with our adversary, this is something that we need to invest more and work more.
Okay, if you were to suggest something, how could you think that things can be done differently to make progress towards that end?
Yeah, this is something that needs lots of money, resources, human resource, and your financial resources also. We do not have that. We need to build that infrastructure or ecosystem where there could be private and public partnerships. We need to encourage the private industries to invest into the space system. I'm talking specifically because India has been successful in following this model, where they are now encouraging their private industrialists that if Elon Musk can do something or launch his own spacecraft and satellites, why can't you do in India? And as you would know, that India started its space program after 1 year after we started this program. But then there has been a huge gap. So to cover that gap, if you just focus on the military dividends of space, probably it would be very, very difficult. You do not have that kind of resources. The technology is not being provided to you. There are limitations in that.
Is there also a greater opportunity cost to it as well, if you're just focusing on the military domain only?
No, that's why I said if you just focus on military domain, by the time you reach to a certain level, the technologies would have evolved. So to catch up that, to reduce that gap, you need to bring in the private investors, because if you develop your commercial side, there are always military dividends for any technology that you develop, whether it's a cyber or AI or space. There are military dividends also and the commercial dividends also, because these are dual use technologies. So if you encourage your people to train themselves into these technologies, and you collaborate with the international partners also, and you encourage your private industries also to come into this field, because if you just talk about the space economy, it is going to be around $4 trillion by 2030 or so. There are various estimates that range from $2 to $4 trillion. So if you can just get a fraction of that $4 trillion, it is going to have direct bearing on your economics also. But I'm just focusing on that, the military dividends that you can accrue if you just push your commercial space program and you achieve certain kind of success in the space domain. You can always build in parallel the military, you can use those for military applications. So that's where, if you are asking my opinion, I think we need to focus on that.
Now, speaking of economy itself, do you think, and I know you're not an economist, but do you think there's enough level of seriousness to understand how central is it to the overall elements of national power? Do you think enough attention is given to the question of economy itself?
I don't know if the right attention is given or not. Enough is something else, because lately we had been hearing a lot about geo-economics. And many people who propagate that geo-economics, they do not take into consideration that geo-economics can only work once your own economics is working. So if there's no stability, there's no investment, your own economy is not helping you, so it's quite difficult to work for geo-economics. So sometimes enough, it's more than what is required for that, because you need to maintain that balance once you're talking about the elements of national power. So if you need to bring some political stability also, and then you need to create that ecosystem where your economy can indigenously grow, and then it can provide incentive for the external investors also, and that's how you move towards geo-economics also. But what we do sometimes in Pakistan is that we pick up a theme and then we continue to harp on that without going into the dynamics or the deeper into it, that you need to first correct your fundamentals. then you need to go outboard or reach out to other regions also. Definitely, economy is an important part of your national power. Without economy, you cannot build your defense. Without economy, you cannot provide good life to your own citizens. So it's an essential. But why I'm saying this is that this debate about whether what is more important, economy or defense or politics or things like that, I think everything is important. But economy is definitely at is the center of that. But there's sometimes the focus is misdirected towards a debate, which at this particular moment probably is not helpful for Pakistan.
Now, reimagine, how do you think a performing, a durable, a growing economy can rechange the entire landscape of the country?
Growing economy in terms of
In terms of a growing, a durable, a performing economy can actually change the landscape of the country. How could it really do that?
economy doesn't work in isolation. You have to create that ecosystem where people would be interested to invest, people would be interested to do business, there would be external actors who will be interested to invest in your country. So, for that to happen, you have to provide that stability for the country. And if there is a political stability and there's rule of law, people would be confident that whatever money they are investing, it will not be lost and not taken away by somebody else. Then only your economy can grow. And once your economy starts to grow, definitely it will have dividends for your country.
Right. And now, speaking of, Pakistan's own capacity to produce, market, and sell different platforms, we have some successful products and case study of products like JF-17, Mashak, and Pakistan is also producing drones as well. But when you look at other countries, for example, like Turkey, you definitely come to this conclusion that Pakistan has not been able to, claim the size of pie as other countries are doing already. What do you think can Pakistan really do to sort of revitalize or to sort of, reinvigorate a spirit of entrepreneurship in the defense sector as well?
So you're talking about defense economy. It is again related to the global politics. Over the past many decades, we have been under sanctions by the Western powers, and denial of those technologies to Pakistan has adversely affected your military developments also. So whatever capabilities that we are developing right now, either these are indigenously developed by building a base and then moving forward, and sometimes China does help in your conventional military developments also, like we saw in JF-17 and other military equipment also. So if you want to build that defense economy and compete with other countries, the major suppliers of the mid-level conventional equipment, like you mentioned about Turkey and those, we need to be part of certain regimes, the denial regimes. Those are politically targeted, specifically against Pakistan, to deny access of dual-use high-end technologies. Whereas if we see on the adversary side, India has full access to all those kind of sensitive and dual-use technologies, which are used in WMD also and the conventional capabilities also. Yes, we do not have that kind of a human resource or indigenous industrial base where we can take a start for and start developing those technologies from the scratch and make it exportable also. So that gap or that access to technology partly filled by Chinese equipment also, partly by the indigenous also, and now we have some collaboration with Turkey also and few other countries also. I think again that comes down to politics, how we are seen in the international community, what kind of relations do we have with the major powers or major supplier countries, the technologically advanced countries. So if we have good relations with those and we have a stable economy where we can buy certain equipment because nobody gives it for free, then access to those technologies, high-end technologies, would become more accessible, and you will be able to develop certain systems that like countries like Turkey or India or other countries are developing because they have an easy access. But again, because of our peculiar political environment, our past, the way we played that role during the Cold War and post-Cold War, these sanctions regimes have been used against Pakistan quite often, which has affected your defense economy or defense industries adversely. But despite all these impediments, Pakistan has done far better than what was expected out of it. And that is what we see, that we were able to develop aircraft also. Many advanced countries, they cannot build their own fighter aircraft. So we have built that. We also build Mushak aircraft also. We are now showcasing our new missile systems also, Al-Fatah, the rockets. Recently, I saw that in Saudi Arabia, the defense exhibition where the chairman, Joint Chief of Staff Committee was also there. So we have those kind of systems or weapon systems that we can now market, and they can compete, at least in these in this region where they're using the medium technologies, not very high-end technologies. So we have done pretty well despite all these sanctions, and I think it's partly you can give credit to sanctions also, because if there were no sanctions, we would go for indigenous capacity building also.
But what would be really needed in order to make Pakistan a leading player among the middle power countries as well, to make it a leading player in terms of defense-related exports? What would be really needed in order to sort of redesign the industry at home?
I think we need to, again, as I said earlier also, we need to have public-private partnerships in that context, because purely military cannot continue to invest in building of these indigenous capabilities or building these capabilities indigenously. Private entities need to pitch in, and they have to be demonstrated that there's lots of money into it, because all over the world, the private industries, they develop these military equipment and they earn lots of money. Our private industrialists, they are reluctant because of certain restrictions, or we have also not encouraged much these private investors. We need to bring them on board. One example that we see recently is National Aerospace Science and Technology Park, that spearheaded by the Air Force again. It has various, you can say, branches, sub-branches also. The main is in Kamra, where we have tried to establish that aviation city where your aviation industry and academia, they can get together and they can work for future solutions. And then there is a big setup in Rawalpindi and Karachi also, where the Air Force or the government is encouraging the private industries to work on cyber issues, on artificial intelligence issues, because there's a huge market globally over there. So the Air Force is providing that facilities to them, and many international companies from Turkey, China, and others, they are coming over there. They are setting their shops over there, and they are building or doing research in these future technologies. So that's one way of moving towards that indigenization also, and working on systems that can be used in the future also, and then that is going to help your defense economy in the future also, because the future is all about these technologies. Anybody who gets access to these technologies are able to build indigenously. They are going to lead the future conflicts also.
Dr. Adil Sultan, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. It was really fun having you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Dr. Adil Sultan. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.